It's time for a special edition of House to Home. House to Home Senior Living is a special series to offer help and direction to those facing that next stage in life or those family and friends helping. House to Home Senior Living is brought to you by our friends at Rada Paint, with support from Smooth Transitions and Orchard Crest Retirement Community. Here's your House to Home Senior Living host, Clyde Hawsey.
Welcome to House to Home. I'm Clyde Hawsey with Senior Living, and transition is a very important part. With Senior Living, and as I have become older, and a few of my audience people, along with Ken Adams, we've all gotten another day older, but transition, and my guest today is Ryan McNeice. He's a local active attorney, and Ryan, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I look forward to this conversation because I've been exposed to it through my mother-in-law, through my own personal life, and I know we all find the occasion that we need to deal with things. Sometimes timing is not always the best.
Right.
But conversation, I've had some of the professionals here, we've been talking about it, is conversations is where it all begins. And this can begin over the kitchen table at home. Hey, have you thought about what if?
Right.
And of course, you being involved as an attorney, you see this happening almost every day or thereabouts.
I appreciate you having me. I think there are so many critical issues, and I think you hit the nail on the head that none of these issues are a lot of fun to talk about.
No.
And when you add the psychology of aging parents, aging children, the dynamics between the two, most of us can sit here on and have this discussion, say you should do this and you should do that. But I think from the diversity of cases I've seen and worked with, and the wonderful people we've had an opportunity to work with, it's never as easy as it sounds in this discussion, saying kids should be talking to parents as they're aging and parents should be talking to kids. We know that, and they should, and you're correct that there's never it's never too soon to get started. Folks utilize the verbiage elder care or elder law, but the reality is if you're 30 years old and have kids, you should be doing estate planning. You should be getting your wills, your powers of attorney, health care directive in order and taking care of your younger children. However, speaking specifically with elder care issues, it becomes paramount that, for instance, with a will, a basic will that defines and grants where your assets will go if, in fact, you pass away, whether those assets would go to a spouse or whether it would go directly to kids or grandkids. It's important to get those things in place before there are capacity issues with the elder individual. Because if the individual doesn't have legal capacity, maybe due to a dementia issue or an Alzheimer issue.
Or an accident.
Some type of common tragedy, unfortunately, they then can't actually sign a will. At that point, to your point that you're making, it's too late. They don't have capacity. That is the same for powers of attorney, for financial matters and healthcare matters.
I always try to do this, Ryan, is that when we sit down with people like yourself who are pros in this type of an industry or dealing with issues, a plan of attack, and I always I just finished the show with Tammy, and her first comment says, sit down and have a conversation.
Right.
I'm not going to deviate from that one. I think that even with what you're talking about today, you need to sit down, folks, and have a conversation with your loved one or loved ones.
Yep.
And say, here's what mom and dad are thinking about. Here's what I'm thinking about. What are you thinking about?
Yep. Well, and you're right. By doing so, it creates kind of a issue spotting opportunity where you actually might find out this or that actually isn't an issue. But you also might find out here's a couple critical pieces of the puzzle that we really need to look at. Again, with a power of attorney for financial and health care.
I'm making note of some of these things.
Yeah,
okay?
Yeah, exactly. Those are literally probably the two most crucial documents, because a power of attorney for financial matters and healthcare matters gives somebody else the opportunity, whether it be a spouse or a child or a trusted individual, an opportunity to make financial decisions or healthcare decisions if you are unable to. Obviously, again, that's important even if you're a younger person, but really important as you start to get into the elder care scenario, because what folks oftentimes forget is once an elder individual doesn't have capacity to sign that power of attorney, the only way to grant authority to someone else to make those decisions, that might be moving the individual into a nursing home, retirement home. That's a healthcare decision. Financially, transferring the deed on a house, signing a rental agreement, signing off on title to a car. They literally can't do that. The elderly individual that might be having capacity,
Right.
they can't do that. And they say, well, I'd like to nominate one of my children to do that.
Mm-hmm.
They actually can't legally do that because they can't have that individual sign off on that was what they intended to do. So the only other legal option is a guardian.
Okay.
And you go ahead.
Let me ask this question then. Is this a Washington state law or is this a federal law? Because I know there's some differences and some crossover on the other. And if, we're talking about Washington state now, is that correct?
Yeah, we're licensed in Washington and Idaho, but in a sense, the concept of power of attorneys and/or guardianships is fairly universal.
So it crosses over all state lines in
essentially.
This okay.
I can only speak to Washington,
Right.
Idaho, but this is a universal concept that the ability to contract and have capacity to contract, and the guardianship process is fairly burdensome and expensive. So to avoid that, if you simply do powers of attorney while you have capacity, then a loved one, trusted individual can make those decisions for you.
Is there also two different types of power of attorney?
Well, there definitely is the financial power of attorney and then the healthcare power of attorney.
That's what I wanted to bring across.
That's a good point, though. Some documents can be combined in what they call a durable power of attorney, and they can have healthcare features. In
Right.
our office, we actually just separate out the two because oftentimes people actually have different individuals for those.
Okay. So, again, what he's saying is that you need to talk to somebody who knows what they're commenting about, like yourself. Find an attorney like Ryan who can give you that straight answer and make it very simple. But the first thing is to plan ahead is what we're saying right now.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, again, you're saying power of attorney is probably one of the most important parts, even without even a real need yet today.
Oh, absolutely, because unfortunately, whether it's myself or somebody else, we don't know when that need might be.
Exactly.
So for myself, a financial power of attorney to give my wife the opportunity to make a decision for me tomorrow is very important, whether it be, like I said, transferring the deed on a house or title to the car, practically, pragmatically handling financial or healthcare decisions. Important at any time. Any healthcare tragedy, each of us probably can speak to some family issues. I know I can, where I needed those tools to be in place.
A will. We always hear the word. Do you have a will?
Definitely should have a will. In the state of Washington, there is a statute in place that if you die without a will, the statute acts as what you most likely would have done with your assets if you didn't have a formal will. By and large, it can work if you have a very traditional family variables. It really essentially is, if you died without a will, your assets would go to your next of kin. It'd go to spouse and or kids or nearest next of kin. I wouldn't advise somebody to utilize that as a crutch to a certain extent, that, oh, there's a statute in place where my assets are going to go anyway, because there are so many variables in some of these non-traditional families where the statute doesn't accommodate that. And so it's so much easier to just spell out, I'd like my assets to do this, that, and another thing. You can be much more specific.
Now, with the will, that's one thing. Now, what about the word a trust? Is that another type of a...
Clyde, that is the million-dollar question, because we are asked that all the time. It's kind of that cocktail party concept that everybody comes to us and says, I need a trust. I need a trust. Well, it is a complex question because there are a multitude of types of trust. The two most common are a revocable living trust. So you hear revocable trust or living trust. With a revocable trust, by definition, the person granting it, let's say you're creating a revocable trust, you grant assets to a trust for the benefit of somebody else, but you act as the trustee, you actually, as the grantor of the assets of that trust, can revoke it. That is to be contrasted with an irrevocable trust, where you actually grant assets to a trust for the benefit of somebody else, but it's actually gone. It's out of your estate completely, which brings up other issues, because once it's out of your estate completely, it's not subject to the monetary calculation of estate taxes in either Washington or federal.
Folks, what you're understanding and hearing here now, and God bless you if you can understand everything that Ryan has been saying. He's been saying it very simple, and I've been fortunate to understand some of it. But what we're saying here is that through good planning, transition can take place.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And
there's options in front of us.
And actually, maybe as a to not be an alarmist, if you will,
right.
That yes, this is complex. However, in the conversations that we're having with individuals, believe it or not, we believe if you can keep it as simple as possible,
yes.
It's actually, number one, not legally as expensive, but honestly, it is easier. It's easier to understand what you have. There's value in that, knowing what you've actually done. And we've seen so many examples of folks that have spent a lot of legal funds over the years to create a complex estate planning with a trust in this state and a trust in that state and the will in this state. And somebody probably along the way advised them of all these complex vehicles. Again, to not be an alarmist, if you have your simple will in place, your powers of attorney for financial and healthcare matters, and a healthcare directive, we'll talk about that in a second, probating an estate in the state of Washington or Idaho really is not that burdensome. There's been this notion over the years in California that you need to avoid probate. You need to avoid probate. And how do you avoid probate? That's where the trust concept comes up a lot. That how do you avoid probate? One way, which I'm saying in Washington, Idaho, probate in and of itself should not be a scary concept to somebody. By definition, a probate is just administrating the assets you have and having them distribute to family or whomever you're gifting assets to per what your will says. That's all. That's all it really is.
Okay.
But the general notion publicly is, oh my gosh, avoid probate at all costs. We handle lots and lots of probate. It's just not that burdensome. I mean, there are some outliers of disputes, but it's rare, quite frankly. So how do you avoid probate? By utilizing a trust. You can create a revocable living trust and place all of your assets in that trust to be administrated that way during your lifetime. So then if something happens to you when you pass, your will, you'd have a will, and you'd have the trust. All assets, by and large, would be in the trust. But in your will, it says, hey, if I left a couple assets out of the trust name, I have a pour-over provision into the trust so that all assets are going via the trust. If assets are left out of the trust, though, I think as you heard me just explain, you actually do have to probate a little bit to have that pour-over function for the rest of the assets. So it can be done, but on average, in our experience in the state of Washington, again, this is just our experience. I'm sure there's attorneys charging a lot more. But I'd say most of the probates we do, asset levels from here to here, so even very high-end estates, you're usually, a probate is around $3,500, $2,500, $3,500. So if you enter in the logic of how much you'd probably spend to do a lot of intellectual gymnastics of a lot of trust features, you got to kind of look at the cost-benefit analysis.
Don't get carried away by being too fancy. He said, keep it simple, right?
Yep, absolutely. Keep it simple. And I think the phrase you just used, don't get carried away by being too fancy.
Right. Let's there's so much we can be talking about here, folks. And again, before we started, we said, where do we go? Where do we stop? My point. Now, what about the health? You just touched on that one. And
healthcare directive.
Directive for the healthcare.
Okay, and that's a document that you hear out there is a directive to physicians, or you hear it as a healthcare directive, or living will. You hear it as that sometimes. But we generally call it a healthcare directive. And what that is, we've been talking about documents here with the power of attorneys and a will where you're nominating other people to be my executor of my estate, to be the power of attorney for financial, to be the power of attorney for healthcare. With a healthcare directive, you're not nominating anybody. You personally are making the end-of-life decision of whether you want artificial life support, food, and hydration. By law, you can't nominate somebody else to make a decision for you in that regard. So oftentimes if a loved one, elderly, senior individual is receiving medical care in which there is, by our document would say 2 medical professionals are saying that there is no chance of this individual surviving but for artificial life support, food, and hydration, you're making that decision that I either do or I do not want continued artificial life support. It's a difficult document.
It's a tough subject, isn't it?
It's a difficult document, and I tell clients every day that it is what it is, and that it's a legal document that is used regularly. It does take away the concept of miracles to a certain extent, that you do have 2 doctors saying, I do not believe this person will exist or continue to thrive without artificial life support. We can all read stories out there where
I know
there are, but keep in mind, this isn't a decision that, and I don't mean to be lighthearted, but rather, by analogy, you don't end up at the hospital day one and they look at a healthcare directive and say, no artificial life support, food, and hydration, let them go. But rather, the medical oath to save your life is they are going to actually put you on artificial life support, food, and hydration to see if you cross that bridge. If you don't, those are the decisions that then would be made.
You know, I've had to experience exactly what you've been talking about, folks. So, and with my aunt, and it was a tough one.
Oh,
and to see it all take place and transition according to what her wishes were, it's a tough one. Yeah. And there are no easy answers. I guess I would have to say that the directive was a plus for the kids.
Well,
because they didn't have to make that decision.
I appreciate the way you just described that, because thankfully it is the decision that you don't have to make as kids or loved ones. It has been made. Doesn't make it any easier that that situation exists, but you're not making the decision to pull the plug, as you hear.
Right.
I actually do want to throw out one more document that we don't handle in our office. I mean, we certainly could, but I don't find it as relevant. It's called a DNR, and that is the do not resuscitate. It comes up a lot in conversation because sometimes it's confused in a hospital setting that, oh, do you have a DNR or do you have a healthcare directive? Well, keep in mind the healthcare directive is 2 independent doctors saying I have no chance of thriving without artificial life support. Please, at that point, don't further treat me. A DNR is literally like in a retirement community. If you would fall over in your room and you are unconscious, do not resuscitate me, emergency services. Serious document. And the reason I make a point to explain that is I've heard it confused so many times. Actually, this week, heard a medical professional say, well, she signed a DNR before she went into surgery. Why would, this gal was perfectly healthy. Why would she wouldn't be signing a DNR. You would absolutely save her life. So critical there. 2 different types of documents.
You know, as we begin to build this next step in our lives, and I'm talking about my life,
all of our lives.
I mean, all of our lives, at what stage you want to begin to. The numerous amount of questions that we're asking ourselves or saying, do you know what this means? I've come to the point in my life where I ask professionals, you're one of them, saying, Ryan, where do we begin? Where do we start with this? Can I ask this given question of you? Could our viewing audience give you a call and say, hey, Ryan, I listened to you and it all makes sense, I think. Well, but I want to rely on it. Can they give you a call and ask you these questions?
Absolutely. And I think a critical piece, attorneys, of course, we all could come up with some great attorney jokes, probably. So people love and trust attorneys all the time.
Let me know and I'll tell you at the
exactly. And Kent could help us with some of those. Let's not ask.
No, we won't ask him.
But in all seriousness, the important question to ask an attorney, whether it be me or some other professional, is what would you do? Or even more importantly, what do you do? And so for someone like yourself or anybody else that is utilizing our services, I appreciate or just flat offer my own story of what do I do? Because the credibility of somebody saying, whether it be a doctor, whether it be attorney, insurance professional, hey, in these circumstances with my family, what have you done? What would you do? And so whether it be the idea of getting into a complex trust type scenario, revocable, irrevocable, I'll give them my opinion on. A lot of factual circumstances where that might be relevant. With the facts you're dealing with, I wouldn't waste the money. I wouldn't waste the money. I wouldn't waste the mental capacity of having to administrate this particular trust. I think that's the first question to ask an attorney in an estate planning context is, what would you do? Not maybe what can you do?
Right.
Because we can create and draft a whole host of complex documents. What would you do? What do you do with these facts and circumstances?
Well, from this, Ryan, I think that, again, I'm going to ask the same question. Do you want to put out your phone number that people could actually give you a call or how to make contact with you? Because I think this is real important, folks, because we can be talking to the pros, but how do we get hold of you?
Right. No, I appreciate that. You can find us either Googling McNeice Wheeler attorneys in Spokane. Our phone number is 928-4141, 928-4141, McNeiceWheeler.com, McNeiceWheeler.com, and my personal email is ryan@McNeiceWheeler.com.
There's more than one way of getting hold of him. Besides, you can also contact me and I'll get you hold of him. But I guess, we're getting towards the end of the show here, and I want to share with our viewing audience. Again, you're saying a few of the most important things, and again, there's just a lot of them, but power of attorney.
Yep. The wills, have a will in place for you and a potential spouse or a significant other. Wills, power of attorney for financial, power of attorney for health care, and the healthcare directive or living will.
And that is one of about 14 to 20 questions beyond this that we haven't even dealt with here today. But what Ryan is saying, you have to have these in place. They need to be done now.
Yep. Keep it simple at a minimum, but
the
you should do that.
conversation needs to take place now.
Yep.
And that's what I'm trying to point out.
Yeah.
Even as young, vivacious people would be and will live forever, we're going to have to come back to the rest of the conversation of these 21 questions that we have still sitting out there. Because, that's part of this transition that I wanted to start with the show was on House to Home Senior Living, is that we're trying to help you walk through this senior living part.
I like the theme that you've taken, Clyde, because it actually doesn't need to be as complicated as I think public media, if you will, makes this aspect of the law. It doesn't need to be that complicated. A couple key decisions that are made, communication, as you said, between family members, and there's a ton of value in knowing I have that done. It's in the safety deposit box or the safe or what have you. I have that done. Period.
Or the peace of mind.
Absolutely. There's a ton of value in that.
And there's a lot of value with that one because without being well planned out, it's helter-skelter. And I need a lot of that pulling in.
Yeah.
So, Ryan, thank you for your time today. We filled a lot of the blanks that are out there. We've created a lot more questions for you on House to Home Senior Living. I'm your host, Clyde Hawsey. We're going to see you next time, and I hope we get to see you.
Thank you so much.
See you then. Take care.
See you tomorrow night, and thanks again for taking care of the painting.
I got this.
Bye.
Weekends are made for painting. Let the experts at Rada Paint take care of you.
Hi. This looks amazing.
Rada Paint, over 80 years of quality, tradition, and trust. Find it in every can.
House to Home is produced in Spokane, Washington by SpokaneTalksOnline.com, which is solely responsible for its content. Ask Clyde a question, recommend a guest, and watch this program again online anytime at SpokaneTalksOnline.com. House to Home Senior Living is brought to you by our friends at Rada Paint, with support from Orchard Crest Retirement Community and Smooth Transitions. We wish you a great day